Well, hello and greetings, International Studies 200 students. Welcome back from spring break. I hope you had a restful and productive week off, and I hope that we've returned rejuvenated and ready to conclude the remaining few weeks of the semester. Indeed, we are concluding with the content portion of the class this week, so we're reading about the future of globalization in the concluding chapter of our Smallman and Brown textbook, Introduction to International and Global Studies. So we're reading chapter 13 this week, and we're going to ask the question of how everything that we've learned this semester allows us to predict the future of globalization and to work towards solving some of the world's problems. So this week, I'm going to ask you to go back and assess what you've learned so far and use that to enter into conversations about the future, essentially. And so we're going to be reading chapter 13 this week and having a discussion, whether in person or online, and you're going to be asked to weigh in on some of the predictions that the authors make and about global citizenship, which is where we began this semester. And so I just wanted to take a moment and review some of the concepts and terms that we have looked at in general this semester so that it gives us a bit of a refresher in terms of how we think about the future of globalization, which is what we're talking about this week. And so in 1961, if you can believe it, globalization as a term first entered the dictionary, right? So it's a relatively recent term. 1961, and it was rarely discussed back then. It became popularized in the 1980s and 1990s, thinking about how we talk about the world, how we talk about the globe, and then enters into university programs and departments with global studies and international studies departments. And so that's where we started. And we started with looking at globalization as a term, which again is relatively recent. It's 1961, the first time it ever enters into the dictionary, as interdisciplinary. Or in other words, we need to approach global problems through the use of multiple disciplines. And I wanted to start with the definition that Manfred Steger, who is a scholar of globalization, gives us, and then we can kind of hit all of the main points that we discussed this semester. And so he says that globalization, quote, refers to a multidimensional set of social processes that create, multiply, stretch, and intensify worldwide social interdependencies, or interconnectedness as we have defined it. These worldwide social interdependencies and exchanges, interconnectedness, while at the same time fostering in people a growing awareness of deepening connections between the local and the distant. And so as we remember from week one, it's all about world level interconnectedness. In fact, it's the intensified nature or made more intense, made more interconnected in the last 50 to 100 years. So we know that humans have been connected and interconnecting in whatever way since the beginning of humanity, you could say, or the beginning of civilization. However, we wouldn't think about globalization as something that happened thousands of years ago. The way we've defined it this semester is that it's a more recent phenomenon that reaches its height in the mid-20th and 21st centuries. And so it's about interconnectedness, but it's a multidimensional set of interconnectedness or connections. And so what do we mean by multidimensional in this class? So you'll remember that there are a few really general ways that globalization happens. And so we looked at the history of how it happens. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But it happens economically. So we talked about economic globalization. It happens politically. So we talked about political globalization. culturally. So we talked about cultural globalization. We also talked about technology and the environment closing out the semester. And so these are all of the multi-dimensional ways. These are the dimensions of globalization, you could say: economic, political, cultural, etc., etc. I mentioned history also because you have to look at history to understand the way the world works, particularly in terms of globalization. And so remember when we talked about history in the second week of the semester, we said we have to go back to world level phenomena, forces, and processes like imperialism, European imperialism, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and the way that these united the world in an unequal and sort of violent whole and began the process of globalizing as we know it. And we talked about the ways that the histories of these forces would evolve and shape into things like neo-colonialism or neoliberal globalization, the spread of capitalism. And so we have to look back at these world-level forces to really understand globalization in its present day. And we mentioned neoliberal globalization, which connects to our module on economic globalization. And so that was one of the most important ways of understanding globalization because it's really a particular set of economic conditions, exchanges, processes of production and consumption that connect the world and have been connecting the world in vast ways. And so when we talked about economic globalization, we looked at neoliberalism, we looked at institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the mainstays of neoliberalism. We talked about deregulation, privatization, austerity, things like that. We asked the question of whether these looked like neocolonialism, whether it looked like democratic free market institutions that were internationalized. And so we talked about the economic angle or the economic dimension of globalization, which was, of course, inextricable or inextricably connected to the political or political globalization. And in this sense, the political can mean a number of different things, but we sort of generally defined it as the processes of governing, governments, politics, things like that, how societies function in that way. And therefore, the interrelation or internationalizing of political relationships, the interconnectedness of governments, law, and whatnot in the global sense. And so we started with organizations like the League of Nations after World War I in the 20th century, which after its failure led to the United Nations, as we know, in the post-World War II context. And so we looked at all of these institutions and the interconnectedness of politics and of governments and international relations across the world. And we looked at things like democratization, anti-democratic practices, citizenship, things like this. And so this all really falls under the umbrella of political globalization or the political dimension of globalization. And so that's the second main dimension after economic. We also talked about cultural globalization. And so we defined cultural globalization as both the process and condition of the interconnection and interaction of cultures around the world. And so like other forms of globalization, cultural globalization spans both the positive and the negative, as we talked about with the political economic, from cultural plurality, openness, which can create knowledge, worldliness, and an appreciation of different cultures, appreciation of different places, people, languages, travelers, and more, to the negative and oppressive, like racism, exclusionary nationalism and cultural imperialism, which can include trends towards a homogenous corporate world, which we talked about, to cultural appropriation as a form of racism. And so all of these things we talked about in terms of cultural globalization. And then we also talked about what culture is. So we borrowed Clifford Geertz's understanding of culture and everything that entailed. And so culture is a very, very important aspect of globalization that's really required reading, essentially, when we talk about globalization and the future of globalization, which is what we're talking about this week. And finally, we talked about the environment, and not just what the environment is and how important it is to the world as a whole, to the survival of the globe and everything on it, but we talked about environmental concerns or environmental problems like climate change, climate refugee crises, and how those problems are global, and how we have to think about the environment and environmental concerns, not just globally, but in order to think about the future of the world and the future of globalization. And so that really kind of rounded out our multidimensional, or the multiple different lenses that we put on to look at the process and condition of globalization, because we described it as both a condition, as in something that we have now, but also a process that has been changing, has been developing, has been evolving, and will do so as a process. So globalization, both as a process and a condition. And so this review, I want you to go back and think about and reread or look at some of the definitions that we've discussed so far as a way into thinking about the question of the future of globalization, which is what this chapter is about. And so the first thing I want you to do, after you've refreshed your memory in terms of what we've studied so far, is that I want you to go through this chapter, and I want you to weigh in on some of the predictions that the authors make, rather. So they take everything that we've learned and used it to make educated guesses or speculations, of course with evidence behind it, as to what the world's going to look like in the future. What is globalization going to bring? What is globalization going to look like? So they make a number of predictions. For example, one, which we don't need to talk about, is on page 362. And remember that the textbook is written in 2015, so it's already 6 years old. They say that the world will continue to face health concerns such as the danger of epidemic disease, as the influenza pandemic of 2009 illustrated. The increasing density of human populations, the development of antibiotic resistance, and the spread of insect vectors with global warming will mean that plagues are not only a legacy of our past. In other words, epidemics are not just in the past. We don't need to question this prediction that they made. Given the past year, we know that came to fruition with COVID-19. And so they were correct, unfortunately, in this prediction. And that's just an example of using information and science and evidence and information in a way that allows us to make predictions about what the future will hold. So we can't tell the future as one would with a magic whatever you call it, magic bulb or whatever that is. But you can use the information that we do have and what we do know to make educated guesses, as they did in this case correctly. So I want you to go through and look at the other predictions that they make in this chapter, and I want you to weigh in and ask yourself, with everything that you know from this semester, is this or that claim, this or that prediction, correct or incorrect? Do you agree with these predictions, or do you disagree, and why? So you want to have evidence to back that up. So I want you to, the assignment is I want you to weigh in on at least one or two of these predictions that they make, and to explain why you agree or disagree. It's fine to disagree, it's fine to agree. You just have to bring up supporting reason or evidence to back up your point. And this will be a stepping stone to our discussion this week. Again, whether online or in our live discussion on Thursday. The second thing that they do, which I want you to look at, is answer the question of why global citizenship is important in thinking about the future of globalization, and the future of global problems or global concerns. So I want you to go and read through the biographies, quote unquote, biographies of a few select global citizens that they highlight. For example, Chico Mendes, Vandana Shiva. And I want you to assess why global citizenship in their case was important, or how they were global citizens. And then I want you to answer the question of why it's important to be a global citizen or think like a global citizen in order to solve the world's problems or upcoming problems in whatever respect. So what are the ways about global citizenship being or doing or thinking like that would potentially help us as a nation, as a world, as globally minded folks, and how can we solve some of these problems, and how can global citizenship get there? So that's your assignment. I want you to go through, weigh in on some of these predictions, and then take a stand on global citizenship. How can it help? As you reflect on what we've learned so far this semester. So we'll continue the discussion online and in person. I'll see you then, and be well.